Good morning. Today I will be reading from the sixth book in the Left Behind series. This is the book called Assassins, and today I am going to be reading chapter 22. And I will begin to read now. If anything, Buck decided the speaking gift Nikolai Carpathia had first demonstrated at the United Nations 3.5 years before had only improved with time. Buck, back then, he had used his prodigious memory grasp of facts and history and mystery of several languages to wow even the press. Who could remember when the working media had risen as one to endorse a rousing speaker? Of course, the first internationally publicized speech had come within days of the disappearance from the earth of millions of people, including all babies and most children. Carpathia had appeared the perfect man for the perfect moment, and a terrified world, including at first Buck, embraced him. The globe seemed as one to look to Carpathia as a voice of peace, harmony, and reason. He was young, handsome, dynamic, charismatic, articulate, brilliant, decisive, and humble. It appeared he reluctantly accepted the mantle of leadership thrust upon him by an adoring populace. Nikolai had reinvented the world, dividing it into 10 regions, each with its own potentate. In the midst of the increasing strife that impacted the globe even worse than the loss of millions at the rapture, he stood as a paternal voice of comfort and encouragement. Through World War III, famine, the great wrath of the Lamb, earthquake, meteor strikes, maritime disasters, contamination of waterways, global darkening and cooling, swarms of scorpion locusts, and more recently the plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur that had taken yet another third of the population. Still, Carpathia held firm control. There were rumors of insurrection on the parts of at least three subpotents, but nothing had yet come of that. Grieving, desperate people often railed about the New World and why it seemed to get worse, only to have Nikolai calm them over the airwaves with promises, sympathy, and pledges of tireless effort. They believed him, especially those whose lives were dedicated to personal freedom at all cost. While the global community rebuilt cities and airports and roadways and communication systems, murder, theft, sorcery, idol worship, and sexual sin were on the rise. These latter three were actually applauded by Carpathia and by all who called bad good and good bad. The only chink in Carpathia's armor was that he seemed impotent before the two witnesses in Jerusalem. That he would schedule his global gala to usher in the first day of the rest of the utopia in the city where the two had held sway for so long appeared the height of cheek. If Nikolai was again humiliated by his inability to control them, if they could not be stopped from turning the water to blood and withholding rain, the fabric of his leadership might finally begin to fray. Yet here he was, facing the cameras that broadcast his image to international TV and the internet. Now 36, confident and charming as ever, he strode back and forth across the stage behind his security team. Not content to stay at the lectern, he kept moving, making sure his wave and smile reached every segment of the live audience that seemed unable to get enough of him. Finally, he raised his hands and received undivided attention. Without notes, without pause, without a misspeak, Carpathia performed for 45 minutes. He was interrupted by enthusiastic applause with nearly every phrase, and if he was animated at the beginning, he seemed even more energized by the end. He acknowledged the hardships, the grief, and sadness that came with individual loss, and the work that still needed to be done. He allowed a tear in his voice as he spoke of so many of you beloved compatriots who have suffered bereavement. As Carpathia surged towards his dramatic, flourishing conclusion, he spoke louder, more directly, even more confidently. To Buck, it seemed the crowd was ready to burst with love. They trusted him, believed in him, worshipped him, counted on him for sustenance. Nikolai took one dramatic interlude where he strode back to the side of the lectern, leaned against it with one hand, crossed his feet at the ankles, and put his fist on his hip. His look on the giant screens throughout the plaza was cocky and arrogant and pregnant with promise. With an "Are you ready for this?" smirk that created murmurs of excitement, laughter, whistles, and applause, plainly he was ready to make some bold pronouncement. Carpathia let the tension build, then stepped purposefully behind the lectern and gripped it with both hands. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "as you can see on your program, we will reassemble near the Temple Mount. There we shall establish the authority of the global community over every geographic location." Cheers and more cheers, regardless who is proclaiming this or warning that or taking credit for all manner of insidious attacks on this city, this area, this state. I will probably put an end, personally, to the religious terrorism perpetrated by two murderous impostors. I, for one, am tired of superstitious oppression, tired of drought, tired of bloody water. I am tired of pompous so called prophecies of gloom and doom and of pie in the sky by and by. If the Jerusalem twosome does not cease and desist tomorrow, I shall not rest until I have personally dealt with him. And once that is accomplished, we shall dance in the streets. The throng surged toward the stage, lustily cheering and chanting, "Nikolai, Nikolai, Nikolai." He shouted over the din, "Have fun tonight. Indulge yourselves. But sleep well, so tomorrow we can enjoy the party that shall have no end." As the helicopters reappeared and people were cleared from the landing area, Carpathia waved and smiled as he headed toward the steps. Whatever. Okay. Leon followed quickly and knelt, thrusting out his arms and waving in gestures of unworthiness. To Buck's amazement, most of the crowd followed suit. Tens of thousands dropped to their knees and worshiped Carpathia as they would an athlete or a performer or a god. Rayford was beside himself. To keep from being conspicuous in his refusal to kneel, he kept moving. Each step brought him closer to the front, and inside his robe he pulled the saber from its block. The heavy, solid, lethal feel both invigorated and scared him. He felt as if he were dreaming, watching himself from afar. Had it come to this? Had he become this crazy man who had won out over the pragmatist? Unless he could somehow be sure this was God's plan, he didn't dare inject himself into history. Whoever was the assassin, he would never again be free. That was sure. The perpetrator would be identified on tape and wouldn't get far. Rayford was within 50 feet of the stage when Carpathia gave a final wave, ducked, and disappeared aboard the helicopter. The chopper lifted off directly over Rayford's head, and he could have shot it from the sky. He gritted his teeth and slammed the saber back into the block. He replaced it in the big inside pocket, pushed his hands back out through the armholes, clenched teeth, made his temples throb. As the crowd flooded out to play, Rayford determinedly marched the miles back to his car, jaw still set, hands hidden by the billowy sleeves. Unless God made him, he would not do anything rash. Buck missed his family. The spectacle at the Gala Plaza left him sad. He sleepwalked the streets, idly following the crowd, but making sure he was headed back toward his hotel. He called home, talked to Chloe, talked to Kenny, talked to Tyson, called New Babylon, talked to Dave, and met Annie. He hated to beg off after having talked to her for the first time, but a beep told him he had another call, and the readout showed it was Leah. Sorry to bother you, Buck, she said, but I had a disconcerting day at Buffer and wanted to tell someone. No problem, but you're supposed to be briefing Rayford, aren't you? I'm not supposed to even call him until Friday. What? She told him of Rayford's instructions. And if there's trouble, I guess I'm to call you. What can I do? Rent a car and drive to France? No, I know. Did you see Hattie? They're considering my request and will let me know. Doesn't sound good. Seems fishy, Buck. I don't know whether to bolt or play it out. Let me call Rayford and find out what the deal is. Would you? Buck stopped under a street light within blocks of the Wailing Wall and called Rayford's personal phone. He would know who was calling from his own readout. Rayford answered. This had better be important, Buck. I'd say hanging one of our own out to dry is important. How can you strand her like that? Rayford sounded bored. What's her problem? She get herself into trouble? Buck brought him up to date. Tell her to stay with the plan and not to call you or me until Friday. What have you got going, Ray? Buck, listen. When I told Leah I didn't want her to call me till Friday, I didn't expect her to run to you. I need you to trust me. Buck sighed and reluctantly agreed. He decided not to tell Chloe that he and her dad might eventually have to have it out. He didn't know what the problem was. Buck climbed a tree so he could see the Wailing Wall, and there were Eli and Moshe. They still stood shoulder to shoulder, staring, unmoving, in the same position as he had seen them. Crowds tauted. He called Jakov for a report on Chaim. Good news and bad news, Jakov said. The tests are positive. What can be bad? The doctor can't determine the cause of the paralysis or the speech loss. It looks and acts like a stroke, but there doesn't seem to have been one. The next morning, Rayford rose and got an early start toward the Wailing Wall. The path was wet in spots and from more than dew. He was stunned to find the crowds huge 2 hours before the vaunted confrontation. Rumors flew that the memorial service for Pontifex Maximus Peter II had been called and canceled due to lack of interest, that Miss D'Angelo had already been defrocked. Apparently, Enigma Babylon would die with its founder. No room even for pagan religion in Carpathia's orbit. With his saber inside his robe, Rayford elbowed his way to the middle of the bustling crowd. He had not slept well, praying most of the night, and now he wished he could sit. But he endured. The witnesses stood like statues, as people said they had for hours. Surely they would become animated when Carpathia arrived to challenge them. A block away, loud bands rehearsed for all day, all night party. Buck tried to climb the same tree he had the night before, but GC security shooed him away. He found a spot on a rocky ledge with a clear view over the crowd. He was saddened by the silence of the witnesses, wishing that when Carpathia arrived they would at least go down swinging. But the due time was upon them. This was a 1261st day. The Bible said they would be overcome. At a minute to 10, the sky came alive with helicopter rotors, and as at the gala site, 3 choppers brought the Pochtons, Fortunato, no Enigma Babylon rep this time, and finally Carpathia. It marked the first time Buck had seen him without a tie. He wore expensive shoes and slacks, an open collar shirt, and a cashmere sport coat, and what looked like a Bible protruding from one of the pockets. The Pochtons and Fortunato stepped behind a barrier that separated them from the crowd. Lights beamed, cameras whirled, and Carpathia swept to the fence. His shirt was equipped with a wireless mic, and he stopped for a dab of powder from a makeup artist. He smiled to the noisy crowd and approached the witnesses. He stood still, only their chests moving with their breathing. Carpathia, like a magician, whipped off his sport coat and hung it from the top of a pointed bar in the fence. Whatever was in the pocket made the coat sag to the side. When Nikolai rolled up his sleeves as if to fight, the crowd went wild. "And what do you gentlemen have to say for yourselves this morning?" he said, looking first to the witnesses and then to the crowd. Buck prayed they would be eloquent, challenging, and forceful. In Illinois, it was the wee hours of the morning. Tyson sat before the television in his pajamas and robe and slippers. Chloe sat in a chair. "The baby sleeping?" Tyson said. Chloe nodded. "I pray he sleeps through this." When Carpathia began with the challenging question, Chloe said quietly, "Give it to him, Eli. Come on, Moshe." But they did not respond. "Oh God," Tyson prayed. "Oh God, oh God. They are oppressed and they are afflicted, yet they open not their mouths. They are led as lambs to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent. So they open not their mouths." For a second, Buck wished he had a weapon. He had a clear sight path to Carpathia. What arrogance, what ego. How he would love to pop Nikolai between the eyes, even with a slingshot. He shook his head. He was a journalist, an observer. He didn't claim to be objective. His heart was with the witnesses, but neither was he a participant. Rayford could hardly keep still. He bit his tongue to keep from shouting at Carpathia. He slipped his arms inside his robe and held the box in both hands. If Nikolai was going to make fools of the witnesses, maybe he would wind up the fool lying in his own blood. Carpathia was in his glory. "Cat got your tongues?" he said, pacing before the silent saints, peeking. "Cat got your tongue?" he said, pacing before the silent saints, peeking at the crowd for encouragement. "The water in Jerusalem tastes cold and refreshing today. Run out of poison? Co-conspirators run away? Lose access to the water supply?" The people cheered and mocked. "Throw them out," someone yelled. "Arrest them, jail them, kill them." Rayford wanted to shout, "Shut up," but would have been drowned out by the bloodthirsty mob anyway, and Carpathia played them. "Was that rain on my window this morning? What happened to the drought? Say, does anyone see locusts, horsemen, smoke? Gentlemen, you are impotent." The crowd ate it up. Rayford seethed. "I proclaimed this area off limits to you 2 years ago," Carpathia said, his back to the crowd, but the microphone allowing him to be heard everywhere, including on TV. "Why are you still here? You must leave or be arrested. In fact, did I not say that if you were seen in public anywhere after the meeting of the cultists, that you would be executed?" Carpathia turned to the crowd. "I did say that, did I not?" "Yes, yes, execute them." "I have been remiss. I have not carried out my duties. How can I stand before the citizens who have charged me with upholding the dictates of my office when I have allowed this crime to go unpunished? I do not want to be shamed before my people. I do not want to be embarrassed at their party today. Come out from behind that fence and face me. Challenge me, answer me, climb over, fly over, transport yourself if you are able. Do not make me open the gate." Carpathia turned to the crowd again. "Should I fear their very breath? Will these dragons incinerate and slay even me?" The crowd was not as loud now, laughing nervously. The witnesses did not move. "I am at the end of patience," Nikolai said. The head of the GC peacekeeping force produced a key from his pocket and handed it to Nikolai. He unlocked the gate, and the crowd edged back. Some gasped. Then they fell silent. Carpathia opened the gate with a flourish and rushed the witnesses. "Outside," he shouted, but the two ignored him still. He moved right of Eli and shoved him into Moshe, making them both stumble toward the gate. He herded them through, pushing, bumping, and jostling. The crowd fell back more. Carpathia grabbed Eli and Moshe by their robes and slammed them back against the fence, then turned his back on them and smiled at the crowd. "Here are your tormentors," he said, "your judges, your prophets." He spat that last. And what do they have to say for themselves now? Nothing. They have been tried and convicted and sentenced. All that is left is the rendering of justice. And as I have decreed it, I shall carry it out. He turned to the two, tugging their robes again until they stood 6 feet in front of the bars. "Any last words?" Eli and Moshe looked at each other and lifted their heads to heaven. Carpathia strode to his jacket and removed the black object from the pocket. Rayford was stunned to recognize it. Nikolai hid the box from the crowd, his back to them. As he separated a saber handgun from its adjoining piece, he backed about 10 feet away from the witnesses and pointed the weapon at Eli on his right. The sudden explosion made everyone recoil and cover their ears. The bullet entered Eli at the neck, and the force knocked him off his feet, his head slamming into the fence before his body crumbled to the ground, blood gushing. The huge exit wound splattered gore on the fence and the stone building behind. Moshe knelt and covered his eyes as if in prayer. Carpathia shot him through the top of the head, making him flop into the fence and land on his chin, limbs splayed. Rayford's mouth was dry, his breath short, his pulse reverberating to fingers and toes. All around him, people held their ears and gawked at the remains. Carpathia fitted the gun back together, slipped it into the jacket pocket, put the jacket back on, and with a closed-mouthed smile executed a deep bow to the crowd. Rayford was overcome with such a passion to shoot Carpathia that he lowered his shoulders and rammed into the man in front of him, who let out a horrific grunt just as the crowd responded to Carpathia. They jumped and spun and cheered and laughed and shouted and danced. Rayford bulled forward, trying to get to Carpathia, all the while trying to detach his own saber. The crowd swayed together, falling, wrestling, enjoying themselves. Rayford tumbled in the middle of it, his arms inside his coat, unable to get up. He forced one hand out of his sleeve so he could push off the ground to stand, but he was knocked over halfway up. He swung his elbows to clear space, but in the process the saber box rattled to the ground. He felt for it as he sat there, battered back and forth by waves of revelers. He forced both arms out just as someone knocked him back and his head slammed the concrete. He rolled and jumped up, a bump rising to the back of his head. Where was the saber? Had it stayed together? It was fully loaded, and there was no safety. Buck stood on the rocky ledge, drained. He watched the dancing, the kerosene, the helicopters collecting Carpathia and the other VIPs and whisking them to the party site. Buck hated the sight of the grisly bodies of his beloved preachers. How he had come to cherish their dark, leathery skin, their thick, dirty feet, their smoky sackcloth robes. They had been so regal, majestic, patriarchal. Their bony hands and shoulders, wrinkled necks and faces, long gray hair and beards only added to their wonderful supernatural mystery. Their bodies had been destroyed. Formerly invincible, they had been blasted against the iron fence, leaving them next to each other in grotesque heaps. Buck was embarrassed for them, exposed in death. Their robes rode high on their legs, their hands curled beneath them, eyes open, mouths agape. Their blood ran the blackest and red under bodies torn apart by a weapon so technologically advanced that calling it a handgun was the ultimate understatement. Buck knew what came next. He did not need to witness the celebrating that had been scheduled for noon to midnight, but which would last more than 3 days. He looked with deep sadness on sin came to fruition, on evil, personified in people who had had every chance, been given every warning. Tyson lowered his head. I could not have imagined how ghastly. Chloe appeared unable to tear her eyes from the screen. Buck must be there. Tyson rose. Chloe, we have turned a terrible corner. This is only the beginning. Soon Carpathia will not even pretend propriety. Most will be powerless to resist him. Rayford spun and crouched. Desperate for the saber, he stepped on it, reached for it, and was knocked about again by crazed dancers. He dropped to his knees and grabbed it with both hands, hugging it to his chest as people climbed over him. Finally, he tucked it back inside his robe and fought to the edge of the crowd. Carpathia was long gone by now. Buck headed back to the hotel, passing celebrants on every corner, crowded around TV sets. He phoned Leah. No answer. For the next 3 days, the gala was centered at the party venue. Music blared and speeches decried the Jerusalem twosome and praised Nikolai. Fortunato urged everyone to view Carpathia as a deity. Perhaps the deity, the creator, God, and savior of all mankind, and the people cheered. The only mention of the death of Peter II came from Carpathia himself, who said, not only was I tired of the preachers and their legalistic imperialism, and I was also tired of the intrusive enigma Babylon faith, which shall now be reinstituted. Individual souls can find within themselves a deity necessary to conduct their lives as they wish. I esteem individual freedom over organized religion. Rayford began to spend time near the gala stage where the closing ceremony would be held Friday night. He calculated angles, lines of sight, when to arrive, where to stand, where to move, how to get himself in position should God choose to use him. The ceremony would end after dark with a speech by Carpathia. Perhaps that would be the moment. All over Jerusalem, people celebrated. Buck was sickened that every newscast showed Eli's and Moshe's bloated bodies decayed and steaming in the sun. Day and night, crowds danced around them, holding their noses, sometimes venturing close to kick the corpses. Blood and tissue formed a sticky mess around them. From all over the world came reports of celebrations of people exchanging gifts as they would at Christmas. From the occasional commentator came the suggestion that it was time to get past this, to give these men a proper burial and move on. But the celebrants would have none of it, and global polls showed huge majorities favored refusing them burial, letting them lie. On Wednesday evening, Buck had finally been permitted to see Chaim in the hospital. Though his color was good and his speech had improved, his face drooped. His left side was stiff, his right hand was curled. Chaim's doctor was still puzzled by the result of his test, but he was reluctant to accede to Chaim's request to go home and die in peace. Chaim pleaded pitifully to Buck, slurring, "Just wheel me out of here, please. I want to go home." By Friday dawn, Buck had still been unable to reach either Leah or Rayford. He did, however, receive a surprising call from Jacob. I don't know how he did it, but Chaim talked his way out of there. He had improved enough to come home, and the doctor now believes he may have had a small stroke that acted like a big one. He looks no better to me, but he can make himself understood, and he's ordering me to take him to the closing ceremony tonight. And that is the end of chapter 22. Next, we'll be reading chapter 23. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful day.